There's a strange moment that happens when you're about to finish something important. The project is 99% complete. The work is good, better than good actually. But something stops you from pressing send. From publishing, from showing it to the world. You tell yourself you need to review it one more time. Just polish this section, maybe rewrite that part, and then the deadline passes, or the opportunity closes, or you simply never share it at all. Or perhaps it's the other version. The job you didn't apply for because you didn't meet every single qualification. The promotion you talked yourself out of pursuing. The creative work you keep preparing for but never actually begin. You're almost ready, almost qualified, almost there. Just need a bit more time, a bit more skill, a bit more certainty. We call this perfectionism, and we think we understand it. We think it's about high standards, about wanting to do things well, about fear of failure. We think it's a strength taken too far, conscientiousness gone rigid. But what if this isn't about standards at all? What if the real fear isn't that you'll fail, but that you'll succeed? Carl Jung spent his life studying what lives in the unconscious. The parts of ourselves we cannot see, but that shape everything we do. He identified what he called the shadow, the repository of everything we've disowned, denied, or deemed unacceptable about ourselves. And he identified the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world's demands, the carefully constructed self we present to earn approval and avoid rejection. For the perfectionist, these two structures create a trap that looks like virtue but functions as a cage. Because here's what perfectionism actually is. Not a personality trait, but a defense mechanism. Not high standards, but a sophisticated way of keeping yourself small. It's the psyche's strategy for avoiding something far more threatening than failure, the weight and responsibility of your own magnitude, the terror of being truly visible, the unbearable possibility that you're actually capable of what you claim you're working toward. The perfectionist lives with a question they cannot consciously ask. Who am I without my achievements, without my credentials? Without the endless striving toward an ideal I can never quite reach? The answer to that question creates vertigo. Because if worth isn't earned through flawless performance, if identity isn't secured through constant improvement, if the mask you've spent your entire life constructing can come off, then who are you underneath? This is not weakness. This is design. This is the psyche protecting itself with the only tools it learned to use: control, precision, the illusion that if you can just get things right enough, you'll finally be safe enough. That if you can polish yourself into perfection, you'll finally be beyond reproach, beyond abandonment, beyond the terror of being seen as you actually are. But to understand what perfectionism is really defending against, to see why it keeps you perpetually preparing for a life you never actually claim, we need to examine what's being held in the shadow. And here Jung's insight becomes radical. The shadow doesn't only contain what we think of as darkness. Jung made a discovery that overturned everything psychology thought it knew about repression. The shadow, that psychic repository of everything we've disowned about ourselves, doesn't only contain what's morally reprehensible, shameful, or dark. It contains, as Jung wrote, not only morally reprehensible tendencies, but also a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. The shadow holds your vitality, your creative fire, your authentic ambition, your power. Jungian analyst Robert Johnson spent decades working with what he called the golden shadow, the suppressed beauty, strength, and virtue that individuals cannot integrate because these qualities once threatened their survival. A child's brightness that provoked a parent's envy. A young person's vitality that overwhelmed anxious caregivers. An authentic voice that violated family silence. These qualities don't disappear, they go underground. They become shadow material, as inaccessible and unconscious as rage or greed, but far more difficult to reclaim because the ego has no framework for understanding why goodness would need to be hidden. For the perfectionist, this is the architecture of the trap. You learned early that certain expressions of yourself were too much, too loud, too confident, too free, too ambitious, too alive. Perhaps you watched a sibling get punished for their exuberance and learned to compress yours. Perhaps you sensed your parents' fragility and made yourself smaller to keep them intact. Perhaps you grew up in an environment where conditional love was the only love available, where acceptance arrived only when you performed, achieved, excelled, controlled yourself into an acceptable shape. So you found a solution: perfectionism, a way to channel ambition without claiming it, a way to strive without ever arriving, a way to work toward power without ever actually holding it. The endless pursuit of an impossible ideal kept you perpetually in motion while ensuring you'd never have to face what you'd become if you stopped running and simply stood still in your actual capacity. Psychologist Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, observed that the shadow contains a great concentration of life. When individuals succeed in turning toward what they've disowned, she wrote, they rediscover a new potential of life. Everything becomes exciting, dramatic, full of positive and negative possibilities. But the perfectionist cannot turn toward this aliveness, cannot touch it. Because touching it would mean acknowledging the magnitude that's been there all along, the talent you've minimized, the impact you could have, the authority you're capable of wielding. It would mean confronting the question you've spent your life avoiding. What would happen if I stopped hiding? This is why perfectionism feels so virtuous, so necessary, so aligned with your values. It is aligned with your values, the ones you absorbed about staying small, staying safe, staying acceptable. It lets you express ambition while guaranteeing you'll never arrive at the destination where people would actually see you. It lets you work intensely while keeping the work perpetually unfinished, perpetually improvable, perpetually not quite ready for the world. The psyche keeps this aliveness sequestered like a caged animal. Too much, too dangerous, too real. Better to exhaust yourself pursuing an impossible standard than to risk what would happen if you claimed the power that's been waiting in the dark all along. Keeping power in the shadow requires constant vigilance. It requires sophisticated psychological machinery to ensure that what's repressed stays repressed. And this is where perfectionism reveals its true function, not as a drive toward excellence, but as an intricate system of avoidance. Perfectionism's most sophisticated trick is this: it keeps you focused on the wrong thing entirely. You obsess over whether the email is worded correctly, whether the presentation slides are perfectly aligned, whether you've considered every possible objection, researched every angle, prepared for every contingency. Hours disappear into refining details that no one else will notice. You tell yourself this is thoroughness, professionalism, care. But watch what's actually happening. You're polishing the same square inch of floor while the house burns around you. This is shadow avoidance through minutia. By keeping consciousness locked on controllable details, the psyche never has to encounter what's uncontrollable. The disowned impulses, the authentic desires, the magnitude of power that would disrupt everything you've built your identity around. The International Association of Analytical Psychology names this pattern explicitly. Perfectionism functions as a rejection of wholeness in favor of an omnipotent fantasy. The belief that if you can just get things right enough, you'll never have to face what's unacceptable. Jung was unambiguous about the cost. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The perfectionist experiences their driven striving as chosen. They do not recognize it as compulsion. They do not see the autonomous complex running the show while the ego believes itself in charge. But the psyche knows, and it protects itself through self-sabotage. Personality researchers Lital Yosipov and Paul Hewitt discovered something that shouldn't make sense. Perfectionistic concerns strongly correlate with procrastination. The person with the highest standards is the one most likely to miss deadlines, leave projects unfinished, avoid starting altogether. They found that fear of failure and the overgeneralization of failure mediate this link. Perfectionists experience a cognitive preoccupation with the possibility of failure and hypersensitivity to overreact and amplify failures, but there's a deeper mechanism at work. Psychologist Simon Sherry examined psychology professors, individuals whose careers depend on publication, and found that self-oriented perfectionism negatively predicted research output. Higher perfectionism meant fewer publications, fewer citations, less impact, even after controlling for conscientiousness. The conclusion: perfectionism may represent a form of counterproductive overstriving that limits productivity. The conscious mind strives. The unconscious applies the brakes. This is not laziness. This is not poor time management. This is the psyche sacrificing opportunities to preserve equilibrium, because what would success actually require? Visibility, scrutiny. The end of the narrative where you're still working towards something and haven't yet failed. Self-sabotage guarantees a predictable outcome, failure through avoidance, rather than risking the more destabilizing possibility that you might actually succeed, and then you'd have to live as someone capable, responsible, seen. And overseeing all of this machinery is the voice you know intimately, the one that tightens your chest when you approach completion, the one that freezes your hands over the keyboard, the one that reviews your work and finds it wanting, always wanting, never quite enough. The harsh internal critic that sounds like care, but functions as tyranny. Organizational psychologist Manfred Ketz de Vries describes this voice as one that never applauds, only moves the goalpost. Each time you approach the finish line, the standard shifts. The target relocates. What was good enough yesterday is inadequate today. And you believe this voice is helping you, protecting you from mediocrity, keeping you sharp. But watch its actual function. It maintains an anxiety field that makes sustained creative action impossible. It prevents both moral failure and authentic expansion. It keeps the ego perpetually under siege, defending against an attack that comes from inside your own psyche. This is what Jung called a complex, an autonomous psychic content that has you rather than you having it. The inner tyrant's real job isn't quality control. It's ensuring you never finish, never launch, never claim the authority that completion would demand. Because if you actually succeeded, if the work were actually done, if you stood visible in your capacity, then what would the critic's purpose be? What would your purpose be, if not endless striving toward an impossible ideal? The machinery of avoidance is intricate, sophisticated, largely unconscious, but it serves a precise function. And that function becomes clearer when we move from psychological mechanisms to the existential territory they protect against. The archetypal dimension of what Jung called vocation, what mythologist Joseph Campbell named the hero's call. Because perfectionism isn't just defending against exposure or failure, it's defending against destiny itself. Jung wrote about vocation as what is commonly called an irrational factor that destines a man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-worn paths. This is what success would actually demand. Not just competence or achievement, but emancipation, separation, the pressure of becoming visible as someone who stands alone, The perfectionist keeps destiny hypothetical, perpetually preparing for a journey they never take. Because the moment you actually finish, actually launch, actually claim what you're capable of, you step into territory where there are no more excuses, no more, I'm not ready yet, no more, just a little more preparation. You become responsible for your vocation, your authority, your impact on the world. This is what mythologist Joseph Campbell identified as the refusal of the call, a universal stage in the hero's journey where the future hero first refuses to heed it. This may be from a sense of duty or obligation, fear, insecurity, a sense of inadequacy. Campbell's warning cuts deep. Refusal of the summons converts the adventure into its negative. Walled in boredom, hard work, or culture, the subject loses the power of significant affirmative action and becomes a victim to be saved. The perfectionist remains walled in their work, consumed by preparation, victim to standards that ensure they never have to answer the call's actual demand. Because I'm not ready yet translates, in the language of the unconscious, to I'm afraid of who I'd have to become if I said yes. Ready for what? To own your capacity, to bear the loneliness that comes from following a path only you can walk. To accept that your work will be judged, criticized, potentially rejected, not because it's imperfect, but because it exists, because you dared to bring it into the world. Humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow studied this pattern extensively and named it the Jonah complex, the fear of one's own greatness. He observed people engaging in voluntary self-crippling pseudo-stupidity, mock humility, as defenses against what he called grandiosity, arrogance, sinful pride, hubris. Some individuals, Maslow wrote, cannot manage that graceful integration between humility and pride, which is absolutely necessary for creative work. The perfectionist oscillates between these poles without finding center. Either the grandiose fantasy of achieved perfection, where you'll finally be beyond criticism, beyond vulnerability, beyond human limitation, or the deflated reality of endless inadequacy, where you're perpetually falling short. Both states represent what Jungian analysts call ego self-confusion, identifying too much with archetypal power or too little, never finding the human measure between them. This is inflation anxiety. The fear that accessing your full power would make you arrogant, dominating too much, that you'd become the person you learned to fear in childhood, the one whose presence overwhelmed, whose confidence threatened, whose magnitude took up all the oxygen in the room. So hypercriticism keeps the ego small, morally safe, spiritually contained, but it also keeps you brittle, joyless, perpetually at war with yourself. Jung warned explicitly about contact with archetypal energies inflating the ego into grandiosity or moral blindness. The perfectionist hears this warning and makes a preemptive strike. Better to never access the power at all than risk corruption by it. Better to stay small and struggle than grow large and dangerous. But there's an even deeper protection at work. One that feels so familiar you barely notice it operating. Chronic not good enough provides stable identity. Painful, yes. Exhausting, yes. But predictable. You know how to navigate the world as someone striving and struggling. You know the shape of this suffering. You know your role in this story. What you don't know is how to inhabit the self that has arrived. That is responsible. That must answer not am I ready, but what will I do with what I have? Psychologist Carol Dweck's research on fixed versus growth mindset illuminates this structure. The fixed mindset believes capabilities are static, unchangeable. For the perfectionist, the fixed identity is paradoxically that of the striver, the one who works hard but never quite gets there. Arriving would shatter the identity. Success would trigger what researchers call identity disruption. Who am I without my struggle? Without the narrative where I'm building towards something I haven't yet achieved? Failure as safe identity protects against this vertigo. The economics of staying small become clear. Remaining almost ready means you never have to face greater expectations, increased visibility, the unknown reorganization that genuine success demands. The psyche prefers predictable shame to the terror of becoming someone capable who must now bear that capability's weight. Understanding these unconscious mechanisms is crucial, but understanding alone changes nothing. The perfectionist can comprehend every structure, every defense, every pattern, and still remain trapped within them. Because knowing why you avoid power doesn't dissolve the fear of claiming it. The question becomes, what practices actually shift the psyche's center of gravity? What alchemical operations loosen perfectionism's grip? Jung immersed himself in medieval alchemical texts, not because he believed in transmuting lead to gold, but because he recognized them as psychological documents, maps of transformation written in the language of matter. The alchemist knew something the perfectionist has forgotten. Ex perfecto nihil fit. Nothing comes from perfection. Perfection is sterile, finished, complete. It admits no possibility of growth, no opening for change. The alchemical work requires what the alchemists called prima materia, the raw, chaotic, impure material the perfectionist refuses to touch. The mess, the unfinished, the visibly flawed attempt. This is where transformation actually begins. Jung wrote explicitly, "There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To round itself out, life calls not for perfection but for completeness. And for this, the thorn in the flesh is needed. The suffering of defects without which there is no progress and no ascent." The path forward, then, is not toward better perfectionism, not toward finally getting it right, but towards something that feels at first like failure, acting before you're ready. This is imperfect action as alchemical practice. Each time you publish the work that's good enough but not flawless, each time you share the idea before you've considered every objection, each time you let yourself be seen as an unfinished, developing person, you perform a small operation that loosens the ego's obsession with purity. The tremor in your hands before you press send. The nausea when the work goes public. The vulnerability of being witnessed in your becoming rather than your arrival. Neuroscientist Sarah Lazar's research on neuroplasticity demonstrates that accepting good enough activates the prefrontal cortex while calming the amygdala, literally creating new neural pathways for self-acceptance. Each imperfect act proves what the perfectionist most fears and most needs to learn. Psychic annihilation does not occur. You expose yourself to shame and vulnerability, and you survive. And gradually, the center of gravity shifts from persona security, the desperate need to control how you're perceived, to something more internal, more solid. But there's a specific territory the perfectionist must enter that feels even more threatening than visible imperfection, the realm of what Jung called the inferior function. Jung's typology identified 4 basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, and observed that individuals typically develop 1 or 2 while leaving the others underdeveloped. The inferior function, but creativity lives in this territory. Play lives here. The capacity to learn something genuinely new rather than refining what you already know. Jung observed that play is a key instinct ranking alongside sex and survival. The dynamic principle of fantasy is play. Without this playing with fantasy, no creative work has ever yet come to birth. Perfectionism kills play. It kills experimentation. It kills the willingness to be bad at something long enough to become good at it. The creative paralysis perfectionists experience is not lack of ideas, but refusal of the vulnerability that creating requires, the mess, the uncertainty, the process of working with material you cannot yet control. The practice, then, deliberately choose what you're clumsy at. The writing style that doesn't come naturally. The medium you've never worked in. The conversation you don't know how to navigate, not to master it, but to bear being unskilled, to let the psychic energy concentrated in the inferior function begin to move. And there's one more territory that demands attention: the body. Perfectionism researcher Gordon Flett traces the somatic cost, chronic tension, sleep disruption, exhaustion that rest doesn't resolve. The body keeps the score of what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. Burnout is not failure of willpower, but the soma's forced interruption of a perfectionistic project the psyche cannot stop on its own. Illness, breakdown, collapse. These become the body's language for communicating what the mind will not hear. You cannot sustain this. You are not machine. You have limits. The reintegration of psyche and soma means learning to treat bodily signals as legitimate information rather than obstacles to overcome. Rest as necessary, not earned. Pleasure as valid, not frivolous. The body's no as protective wisdom, not weakness to push through. Somatic therapist Peter Levine demonstrates that trauma and chronic stress live in the nervous system, not just the mind. Healing requires embodied practices that complete interrupted defensive responses and restore regulation. The alchemical work is not comfortable. It requires touching what you've avoided, revealing what you've hidden, tolerating the discomfort of being seen in process rather than in product. But this is how the machinery loosens, not through insight alone, but through repeated embodied experiments in being imperfect and discovering you can bear it. Yet even these practices, imperfect action, engaging the inferior function, somatic reintegration, can become new forms of perfectionism if they're approached as techniques to master rather than invitations to transformation. The frame within which these practices operate determines whether they serve the ego's improvement project or the self's movement toward wholeness, and that distinction is everything. The fundamental shift Jung offers moves the entire project, not from imperfection toward perfection, but from the perfection project itself towards something older, deeper, more truthful, wholeness. This is not semantic play. The difference is structural, ontological. Perfection treats life as a repair project, a systematic elimination of flaws, an optimization of performance, a relentless improvement toward an ideal state where you will finally be safe, worthy beyond reproach. The implicit promise, if you can just fix everything, you will finally be enough. Wholeness rejects this premise entirely. Jung wrote about teleos, the Greek term often translated as perfect in religious texts. But teleos doesn't mean flawless. It means complete, fulfilled, whole. The acorn that becomes the oak it was always meant to become, not an acorn that eliminates its flaws to become an ideal acorn. The shift is from how do I fix myself to how do I become what I actually am. This requires integration of opposites, not their elimination. Your capacity and your limitation held together. Your ambition and your fear acknowledged simultaneously. Your power and your vulnerability both given space. Jung was explicit. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. The perfectionist splitting, where some qualities are acceptable and others must be eradicated, prevents precisely this integration. It keeps the psyche at war with itself, exhausting its energy in internal conflict, rather than channeling that energy toward actual living. Clinical psychologist Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion reveals what perfectionists cannot accept. Self-regard cannot be conditional on constant bettering. The moment worthiness depends on improvement, you trap yourself in an infinite regression you can never arrive, because arrival would mean the improvement project ends, and with it, your justification for existing. Wholeness offers an alternative, less nearly perfect, but more nearly whole. This is what Jung meant by the self, not the ego's constructed identity, but the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, the center and circumference of your being. Jung observed, the self is the center and the circumference of the psyche, the regulating center that brings about a constant extension and maturing of personality. The work, then, is not construction, but recognition. Not building toward worthiness, but uncovering the wholeness. Perfectionism's elaborate defenses were designed to obscure, and this changes what work means. The path forward requires tolerating what the perfectionist has always avoided: imperfect action, incomplete knowledge, visible vulnerability, claiming your power while bearing its weight, saying yes to the call even when you don't feel ready, because readiness is not a prerequisite for vocation. It's what emerges through answering. This is not comfortable. There's no technique that makes it comfortable. The anxiety you feel when approaching completion is real. The vulnerability of being seen is genuine exposure. The weight of responsibility for your capacity is heavy. These are not symptoms to overcome, but realities to bear. Psychoanalyst Otto Rank identified two fundamental fears in dynamic tension: fear of life, becoming too much of an individual, risking isolation by differentiating from the collective, and fear of death, losing individuality by conforming too much, disappearing into the herd. Between these poles, Rank observed, the individual is thrown back and forth all his life. The perfectionist tries to escape this tension by never fully individuating, by staying perpetually in preparation. But Jung's insight cuts deeper. The tension is not a problem to solve, but the ground of being human. Individuation means bearing it consciously, rather than being unconsciously driven by it. The protective function perfectionism served was real. The environments that taught you to stay small, to compress your magnitude, to earn love through performance, those were real. The voices you internalized belong to authorities who may be long gone. The conditional regard you absorbed may no longer operate in your actual life, but it still operates in your psyche, because complexes, once formed, continue autonomously until made conscious. This is the return to what was never actually lost. What you seek through perfection, your worth, your enoughness, your right to take up space, is already present, not as something to achieve, but as what Jung called your essential nature. The work is not transformation, but revelation. Not becoming someone new, but removing the armor that prevents you from being who you already are. Jung's final word on this remains the truest. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness you've been running from contains your life, your power, your unlived magnitude. Perfectionism kept you safe from it. But safety is not the same as aliveness, and you are here now because some part of you knows there is another way to live. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment with your reflections. What's one place where I'm not ready yet might actually be, I'm afraid of who I'd become? Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.